Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is the News Brief. And today we're going to be talking about that one article in the New York Times about Kursk that paints Ukraine as evil. And then we're going to discuss it together in the comments so you don't have to suffer alone and I don't have to suffer alone. So please don't forget to leave me your questions, suggestions, constructive criticism, or anything that comes to your mind because I love all of it and I enjoy reading it. And of course, it creates for a fantastic way to have back and forth communication. Let's go. Let's talk about Kursk, but first, let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump and his awakening. So, Donald Trump recently came out and said that Ukraine and Russia have 50 days to come up with a ceasefire, and if there is no ceasefire, then he's going to impose devastating sanctions on Russia. Which, I mean, at this point, he's already said 2 weeks before, and then nothing happened, and then 2 weeks before that, and then nothing happened, and then 2 weeks before that, and then nothing happened. So, I can keep going, right? But the funny thing is, what he described as his awakening reason. So Trump said that he constantly talks to Putin on the phone and he's very nice and he promises him good things. And then he gets off the phone and tells Melania how nice Putin was and how he understands everything and how he's ready to work with Trump. And then Melania says, that's strange because they just bombed an object of very important civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. And Trump said, I thought about it, and he talks nice, but then he goes off and does terrible things. The funny thing here is that Trump didn't realize that himself. He didn't realize that Putin constantly keeps sweet talking him and then getting off the phone with him and bombing a hospital or bombing a college or bombing a university or bombing a school or bombing an object of critical infrastructure. Trump didn't put that thing together by himself. He put that together because his wife told him. I mean, thank you, Melania. Maybe Donald will finally make someone better than Pete Hegseth the Secretary of Defense. Maybe you? I mean, I'm obviously joking, but that's so funny because she seems to be a lot more competent than Pete Hegseth in that scenario. Well, I mean, at least Trump promised to give Ukraine weapons in the meanwhile, so that's progress if I've ever seen one. Meanwhile, jokes aside, let's talk about the infamous New York Times article about Kursk region and how Ukraine is an evil, evil country who held Kursk region and did all of these horrendous things in there. So the article starts out with these images of Russian soldiers hugging Russian civilians, the images of sad Russian soldiers in Russian churches, minefields, and all of this imagery of destroyed Kursk region. The article basically says that the civilians were terrified of the Ukrainian soldiers and they were terrified of looking them in the face because, those are occupying forces and Ukraine was occupying them and they were hiding in their basements. Now there is footage in multiple documentaries, and I mean multiple documentaries because Ukraine is not stupid enough to have invaded Kursk and held it and not filmed the footage of how things actually have been, knowing that Russia is going to come out with propaganda via New York Times and other outlets. This is also the reason why Americans and British people and the English-speaking world is so susceptible to Russian propaganda, because it's not just Russian news outlets that publish it. A lot of the news outlets that publish it are actually big news outlets like the New York Times. And this is also not the first time that the New York Times published a propaganda piece like that. They have published many propaganda pieces before 2022, the full-scale invasion, that called Ukrainians Nazis and that called the Russian invasion of Ukraine a civil war. The New York Times doesn't necessarily cover the invasion of Ukraine very truthfully. A lot of the times they're looking for balance, as in because there is a war between two sides and of course no one's covering the other side. So there must be something bad going on and we're not looking at it. But that's not true. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not invade Russia. Ukraine held Kursk in order to divert the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But anyhow, so here are the things and the inconsistencies and straight up lies that emerged in the New York Times article. One, it says that Russian civilians were terrified of Ukrainian soldiers and they were hiding in their basement for the entirety of the duration of the Ukrainian occupation of Kursk region. First of all, that was months. They could not have been sitting in their basements for months. Secondly, there are many documentaries, including a documentary piece by Kaylin Robertson, who was a guest on this channel many times, that illustrates exactly what life was like in Kursk region. People were not afraid to come up to Ukrainian soldiers. They came up to them themselves. They asked them for water. They asked them for food. There were lines forming for supplies that Ukrainian soldiers delivered to Kursk region. Actually, when they were asked when Russian civilians were asked what they're afraid of, they said their own army. They were all talking about how Putin and Russia abandoned them once Ukraine came in because their soldiers literally just fled. That's what happened. They actually fled. They didn't even try to defend these civilians. Anyways, Ukrainian soldiers provided humanitarian help. There is a documentary about Kursk region where you can see that Ukrainian soldiers quite literally brought gifts to a little girl's birthday party, and they followed up with the same family over months and months and months. And these families were not like they were not coerced into saying anything. They were not coerced into acting any certain way. It was very evident that these were the same people over the course of multiple months, and that they formed friendships with these Ukrainian soldiers. These Ukrainian soldiers helped them many, many, many times. They brought humanitarian aid. They actually went and cleared some fields from mines. They actually went and helped out restore things. They were doing things that Russian people said they have never had done in their villages to begin with. They didn't have a supply of water because it was a godforsaken village in Kursk region. So a Ukrainian military brought in a generator that powered the whole village, and they started getting water. They've organized schools and other places where Russian civilians could actually live in peace without being afraid of being bombed by Russia. So a lot of all of the destruction in Kursk region is very well documented in all of these documentaries as being Russian bomber jets flying over the region and quite literally destroying everything. And it's also very well documented on Russian propaganda TV. They were literally saying that they would destroy Kursk region and would destroy Suja and would destroy all of these places because they need to smoke out Ukrainian soldiers out of there. And they were saying that Russian civilians that are there don't matter because it's just a collateral damage in smoking out the Ukrainian army. So it's really, really funny that the New York Times would try to portray the damage of the cities as something caused by Ukraine, while Ukraine actually tried to preserve it. Also, in all of the footage from all of the documentaries, from all of the interviews, from everything that was happening in Kursk while Ukraine held it, you can see that kids are running around and riding their bikes. You can see that they're playing outside. You can see that civilians are freely moving around and saying hello and waving to the soldiers. They're legitimately doing everything that they would be doing on any other day, except now they have food they don't have to forage for, and they actually have electricity that they don't have to pay for, provided to them by the Ukrainian army after Russia took that away from them. The next point that I want to make is that there are a lot of destroyed churches and these sad Russian soldiers standing in destroyed churches. So, first of all, a quick search on the New York Times literally shows you that they have never covered the destruction of Ukrainian churches. And there were so many Ukrainian churches destroyed over the course of the Russian invasion. They destroy everything, and they burn icons, they loot, they take away all of the valuables from these churches. They disrespect anything that they touch, right? So that's not an issue for the New York Times. However, the images of sad Russian soldiers in destroyed Russian churches is very sad for the New York Times, and it's worth covering. So again, in many documentaries, one of them we've covered on this channel before, it's been shown and documented that actually Ukrainian soldiers would go to Russian churches during Russian bombardment or in between Russian bombardment, and they would itemize lists with the locals from any given village of things that are valuable in churches, of the icons, of things that need to be preserved. And they actually, with the locals, took those things out of these churches and preserved them in basements of schools or other things that they have designated as shelters. And they actually tried to preserve the Russian culture, the culture that kills us, the culture that came here to destroy us. Another funny thing in this article was that, they interviewed Russian soldiers, and they said that for the first time when they entered Suja, they felt like they weren't occupiers because people were running up and greeting them and hugging them and being happy. So first of all, that should indicate that when they come to Ukraine, they are being treated as occupiers. So why the hell are they here? And why are they trying to occupy these regions if they're saying that for the first time in this entire war, the first place where they felt welcome was the actual territory of Russia, not the 1991 borders of Ukraine? So that should be the main point of the article, is that the Russian soldiers finally felt welcome for the first time on the territory of Suja, which is actually Russia, right? That's one. Two, yes, obviously, they are not welcome on the Ukrainian territory and they're treated as occupiers because they are. If you're coming somewhere, you're facing resistance and people are not happy to see you, then none of your objectives that you're lying about, the liberation of Ukrainian territories and then belonging to Russia, make any sense, because the people that live there don't want you there and don't want to see you there. And they also take Ahmad forces in that article, which are the Chechen forces of Russia, and try to paint them as these heroes who, were diverted from a Ukrainian offensive in Ukraine and sent to Suja. And, these poor guys who had to fight the bad Ukrainian army. Again, they were diverted from a Ukrainian counteroffensive on Ukrainian territory that Russia temporarily holds. Yeah, sure, be diverted to Suja, stay on your own territory. But again, when they paint this picture of Russian civilians running out and hugging them and whatever, there are countless interviews from independent journalists who were able to go into Suja, as well as Ukrainian journalists who actually interviewed people, and the people said that they are not scared of the Ukrainian army, that they're really mad at Russia, that Russia's been bombing them, that they can't believe that Putin abandoned them, that they're scared of their own army because the Ukrainian army treats them better than their own army does. So this entire picture being painted that, like, oh, these Russian soldiers were greeted with love and care because these people were so tired of being under Ukrainian control, they were so scared, is also lies, complete lies. There were some glimmers of truth in this article, obviously, where they were talking about Russian bombardment, and the New York Times also talked about the instance of war crimes that they have recorded early in the invasion, where indiscriminate force was used against Kursk civilians that could amount to the war crimes, but they couldn't establish who has used that force. So first, in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were no Ukrainian soldiers anywhere near Kursk. And also, again, Ukrainian soldiers treat people with respect. And while this article does say some truths that are buried amid the lies, the headline of the article is exactly what people will read, and is exactly what makes up your mind before you even read the article, because hey, most people don't read articles, they read headlines. And the article's headline is "A Landscape of Death: What's Left Where Ukraine Invaded Russia," placing all the blame on Ukraine. Meanwhile, actually, in this same article, they also mentioned that Russia was responsible for bombardment, amid the talks about how, Russian civilians were scared of Ukrainians, and how, they had no food and water, and what were they supposed to do but be friends with the Ukrainian soldiers for 7 months. Anyways, all in all, this is a very typical New York Times propaganda piece where they blur the lines between good and evil, where they blur the lines and make you think about, well, but are Ukrainians maybe as bad as Russians? Oh, but maybe they both do terrible things. Ukrainians have never done terrible things. They actually took care of Kursk better than Kursk was taken care of when Russia was there. And Russia is responsible for bombarding their own people and bombarding churches, and for all of those corpses that the New York Times reporters saw laying around. Russia is also responsible for invading Ukraine and starting this entire situation. And if it wasn't for Russia, none of this would ever happen, and no civilians would have to live in harm. That's all I have for you for today. If you enjoyed this brief, please give this channel a subscription. Also turn on all of your notifications, and like this video, send it to a friend. And of course, leave me your thoughts, questions, and suggestions in the comments down below. Till next time.